Hello everyone, happy Memorial Day weekend. Hope you had a great time. I definitely enjoyed myself even though I was still recovering from being sick. It was great to have 3 days off to spend time with the family, with friends, just to recover and get the body ready and make the final push for the end of the half. For someone who's working in tech, you probably know that it's getting close to the end of half. So a lot of teams are making the final push to get some projects out the door because usually that's when performance reviews comes in. Maybe that's a separate day, a topic for a different day, talking about performance reviews and things like that, because I think there are a lot of interesting insights and discussions to be had about whether or not performance reviews are important. How do you do performance reviews between a full stack engineer and a backend engineer and a front-end engineer? A lot of interesting discussions there, and I have a lot of stories to share from sitting in performance reviews, conversations at multiple different companies and seeing how people are evaluated and being treated and promoted and things like that. But that's not the topic for today. I think that kind of transitions really well. Something I wanted to talk about was transitioning from a junior entry-level engineer into a mid-level engineer, and then from a mid-level engineer to a senior engineer, and then to a staff-level engineer. And then usually when someone reaches staff-level engineer, there's probably a decision to be made to decide what direction you want to do. Do you want to continue as an IC or individual contributor, or do you transition to being a manager? All right, so those are typically the two paths that people take. Today, I just wanted to talk about my experience growing through the ranks, so to speak, of being a junior engineer. Typically a junior engineer kind of getting out, you're just fresh off the college. And for me, that was what happened. I graduated out of college and I landed a job as an entry-level software engineer at a startup. And that's the phase where a lot of things are really new. You've never worked on any of the production tools like GitHub or version control. You've never used VS Code or anything like that. Maybe in college you did a little bit of those things, but typically an entry-level software engineer coming in, your expectations are pretty low, right? You're there to learn, to pick things up, not cause a lot of trouble. And expectation there is to grow really quickly, be able to be productive and commit code, to write code to solve some pretty well-defined problems. And that was my experience. And I was an entry-level software engineer for about 1 year. And then I got my promotion to mid-level engineer. And that was a really interesting experience. Something that I really learned from that was interesting discussions with other engineers. I was like, oh, how do you do this? How do you do that? I was asking a lot of questions just because I genuinely didn't know what to do about those things. For example, this was a cool story that I remember. I was starting out, and in software engineering, when you're trying to commit code, right, there's a conflict. You have a Git conflict. So how do you merge between, how do you merge back into master or trying to merge back into a development branch? And there was a conflict, right? So how do you resolve the conflict? And I Googled around a little bit. I went on Stack Overflow. And then the good thing was that I had a mentor at the time who's a senior level engineer, and he would just kind of sit me down and say, yeah, here's a cheat sheet of all the different Git commands that you can do. And let me explain, here's a diagram of how Git works, right? It shows me like the trees and how things kind of diverge, how do you merge, how do you resolve conflicts and things like that. And through that experience, I think it was enlightening for me because I got to see how a senior level engineer handled issues, right? Explaining them in a simple way that an entry level software engineer who's never worked in production before is able to understand, and then being productive right after that. And I had a lot of kind of questions like that. Like, how do you create a branch? How do you merge a branch? How do you write unit tests? How do you write integration tests and things like that? So a lot of questions for a lot of people that are watching this. Probably if you've had multiple years of experience, it seems like common sense. But for an entry-level software engineer, those things are new, right? So that was like my learning experience. And then I did 1 year of that, just kind of learning the ropes, understanding what were the technical jargon being used, what were the common technologies being used, how to utilize them efficiently and effectively, and just generally not trying to cause trouble. And then I got my promotion to being a mid-level software engineer. And that was when things started to be, you are trusted as being dependable. You can do your own work. So you start getting projects, right? Projects that you're going to drive more end-to-end. right? End-to-end meaning that you're responsible not as much of like understanding the problem, but more of, hey, here's a feature that I need to build. Let's say a simple filtering function that needs to work on a website, right? For example, if you go on there, and this is something that I worked on, there's a website that it's like a table that populates the entire table with different kinds of information. What kind of task was running, how long it's been running for, and all of this information was coming from backend, right? So now you're being asked to implement a filtering feature, right? So for example, can you filter it by date? Maybe you want to give it a certain time range of Monday through Friday from 12 to 12, right? And then maybe you can add some sorting feature there as well. And it's a pretty well-scoped problem where the inputs are going to be a user coming in to click certain things, and the output's going to be, which is a table that has all the data that you're looking for. And I think that's a pretty typical IC4 mid-level engineer kind of problem, right? And that was basically when I started taking more responsibilities and I'm trying to figure out how this technology works, how this component or this piece works with this other thing from the backend that already exists. And I'm trying to add either some new functionalities or to modify some of the existing functionalities. And this was an interesting period of learning because you start to either build new things or you start to modify and take something that already exists and try to modify it in certain ways so that it will work to fit your scenario, right? That's the period where I learned a lot of things about how do you refactor code, how do you make sure releases don't break, how do you make sure there's backwards compatibility, versioning, and all of those things. And that's when you really get into trying to maintain software, trying to write maintainable, well-tested code that's structured in a way that you can test very easily, and things like that. So it was for sure, I think that was a really good learning experience. And that's probably the forming years of a software engineer. Because in that sense, you are learning all the critical skills that people think software engineers typically should have, like writing good code. What does it mean to write good code? You need to start develop some insights or what they called code smell, right? So instincts that would tell you whether or not code is good or bad, right? And why is it good? Why is it bad? Maybe it's bad because it's not well tested, it's difficult to test, it's tightly coupled with different parts of the code base. So I thought that was the time when I learned the most, and also the period where I spent the most time. I was a mid-level engineer for, I think, 2-3 years. When I was at the startup, there were multiple levels to it. So a mid-level engineer 1, mid-level engineer 2, mid-level engineer 3. So I was progressing, right? I was getting from 1 to 2 to 3, but the senior title didn't come until much later when I transitioned to a different company, and then they officially had like senior title. And then I thought that was a period that was very, very well spent because it felt like you were in this pressure cooker, right? Of growing the skills, developing the insights, developing the technical skills and the people skills you need to be a more senior level engineer. So senior level engineer is one step beyond a mid-level engineer, right? So instead of just building a feature like adding filtering, adding sorting, you're being asked to build something that's more complex, that touches on more components. And that's what it makes it more senior, right? Because it's more complex. It touches on, it has more surface areas where things could potentially break. And as the owner of that project, you're responsible for making sure that it works. So what does it mean that it works, right? You need to figure out what are the metrics you gotta measure. How do you define success? What does success look like? Who are the people that you need to engage to make sure that the project can be shipped? What are the dependencies, right? So that's what a senior level engineer really looks like, which is you're taking a much more complex project, figuring out what are the things that you need to build, how do you measure success, and then deliver that. And when I was going through this process of growing into, it didn't feel like it was a natural progression of just take on bigger and bigger things and more scope that comes your way. It felt more of a stepwise change in behavior. And some of the things I really like from in the industry are people saying is that There's a really good book that says, what got you here won't get you there. And I think this is very especially true of whenever you want to get a title change in scope, change in level, what got you to IC4 or mid-level engineer won't get you to a senior level engineer. So essentially meaning that if you keep doing the same thing that got you to being a successful mid-level engineer, that won't necessarily lead you to being a successful senior level engineer, because the behavioral changes there are different. So to put it into something more concrete is, say that you're building features really well, right? Going to the same example of filtering, sorting as a feature. Now being a more senior level engineer, now that you're being asked to do the same thing, how do you see the difference between the two levels, right? And in my view, I think probably like a strong IC4 will be able to do it just as well. And the IC5 that's really strong will be do it just as well. But the IC5, my expectation is that they're gonna go a little bit above and beyond what the IC4 was thinking about. What I mean by that is IC4 is responsible for execution, right? You give them a project, they figure out technically how do you do it, and they execute well on it. IC5 is going to go a little bit above and beyond that. They're going to figure out what are the production metrics you got to measure. What happens if something goes down? Do we have redundancy? Do we have backup plan, right? And then they're also starting to demonstrate some thinking on the people side. Is this project maintainable? Do we have the right number of people working on that project? And if someone leaves the company or leaves the team, do we have backup? Do we have someone else who can play point during this period of transition? And that's where, right, the difference in behavior comes in, because it's not as much on the quality of the work. Sure, the coding quality, in my view, between an IC4 and an IC5, it's not going to be dramatically different between them. It is thinking more holistically about the success of the bigger project that highlights the difference between levels. At least that was my progression of being a mid-level engineer to a senior level engineer, where I had to think more broad, more deep, and thinking about who are the right people to maintain or who has the right skills to work on that project to bring it forward to the next step, right? And that was like interesting part that I kind of learned a lot, and finally making that switch successful. It took a very long time, but having done a lot of practice, talking to mentors, what I think was really helpful was, one, finding a mentor, ideally someone who's not too far ahead in terms of career-wise from you, right? So IC4 looking for IC5 is great, but looking for IC6 or staff level or senior staff, maybe not so much, not going to be as useful because they're so far removed from the work that you're doing today that they're not able to give you the insights and the guidance for you to get to the next level. Even though they've been in your place, but they may have been 4, 5, 6, maybe 10 years removed from where you are. So they can't really give you advice that really is applicable for you at that point in time. So one is finding a good mentor. Number two is finding a good manager. Right, finding a good manager who is able to advocate for you. To have a video that talks a little bit about finding a champion, finding a mentor, which I think is highly critical. Not just because they're gonna be your advocate when it comes to promotion, but also finding a good manager. It's like having a good partner, right? A manager that understands you, what your thinking process is, how you like to be coached, how you like to work with. It just makes your life so much easier. And I didn't realize this until I had my 4th or 5th manager, right? When I was going through different managers, and I didn't realize how to engage them until I had this one really good manager who worked with me really well, understood where I was coming from, understood my goals, and really helped me find opportunities that leverage my skills and helped me to grow really quickly in my career. Right, so I can't stress enough how important it is to find a good manager. If you find a good manager who is able to advocate for you, who understands you well, who really has your best interests at heart, right, stick with them. And it's because it's very hard. I can truly tell you that it's very hard to find a good manager who is able to be your advocate, who has your best interests at heart, because there's too many people who are thinking about empire building, right? They want to build a bigger team so they can get to the next level, and they're trying to shove you further and further down the leadership chain so that it shows that they're growing, right? They're getting more senior, and You're not able to support people anymore because they have a lot more scope. So a lot of these things happen in the industry. I'm not a big fan of it. I truly believe that, to be a good manager, you need to support them well, you need to see them, you need to understand them. And if you find a good manager like that, definitely stick to them. So, find a good manager, and everything else will take care of themselves, right? It doesn't matter as much like credit, who's doing what, when a project ships, because I believe if you have a good mentor, they can help you figure that out. And if you have a good manager, they can help you advocate for it when it comes to performance review, when it comes to promotion. So that's kind of a bit of my experience going through it in terms of what my takeaway. And I've seen some engineers who are extremely smart, who move really quickly from entry level to mid level to senior level to staff level, essentially getting a promotion every single year. These are definitely the outliers, and you don't see them everywhere for sure. But these people either are one, very, very smart, well, a combination of multiple things, right? Being at the right place at the right time, and then also having a really good manager who is really advocating for them and pushing them forward. Usually a combination of multiple things like that, right? The first thing is you're definitely smart, definitely capable. And if you're a software engineer, you're trying to figure out, what are the things that you can do to be a good engineer? What are the skills that you need to learn? Please leave a comment below, or you can send me an email, and I would love to share a little bit more context around how do you be a better software engineer? What are the skills that you need to learn? What were the things and issues, obstacles that I ran into that I think would be useful so that you don't have to go through the same problems I went through, right? Because I think everyone wants to grow really fast in career. So I'm just gonna stop right there. That's really all the content I want to talk about. I just wanted to share a little bit of my perspective on how do you grow. Sorry, I didn't really talk too much about senior level to staff level engineer and beyond. And I think that's a really important topic to cover as well. But I want to dedicate another video separately just talking on this point, because I think it's super important, right? A lot of senior level engineers want to grow to the staff level engineer, but they don't really know how. And I have experience in this area because I personally have gone through that. And I'm working with a couple of engineers on my team working through that transition as well, helping them find projects that they need, helping them find the mentors, helping them find the champions that are able to push them to the next level. I'm supporting, or I have supported, am supporting staff level engineers as well. So I know, understand what the expectations there are. And once you get to IC6 or staff level, what do you need to do in order to demonstrate that you are operating at that level? But I'm going to keep that to a separate video. Sorry, this has gone a little bit longer, but I think there's a lot of interesting things, insights, and stories I do want to continue sharing. But I'm going to keep that